I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream.
50 years ago, Martin Luther King Jr. inspired Americans with his landmark speech.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
But how much of the dream lives on?
That all men are created equal.
We haven't made as much progress as we would have hoped.
What do we want? Jobs! What do we want? Jobs! What do we want?
District residents are employed at half the rate of suburban residents in the construction industry.
Schools in the United States are more segregated now than they were since Dr. King was killed. So we've gone backward in that regard.
Many people misinterpret the dream, that King had a dream and we realized it.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise, live out the true meaning of its creed. Hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech is considered the most important speech of the 20th century. But on August 28, 1963, he was simply listed as a concluding speaker. He was only one of 6 civil rights leaders who spoke on these steps that summer day. And even the journey to the March on Washington had stirred resistance and controversy. And had it not been avoided, it's altogether possible that Dr. King's iconic speech might never have happened.
Meet the Press is a public affairs presentation of NBC News.
Our guests today on Meet the Press are the heads of the 2 major groups participating in the March on Washington this Wednesday, Mr. Roy Wilkins and Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
Just before the march, the deepest fears of a white establishment were spelled out on a popular Sunday morning talk show.
Mr. Wilkins, there are a great many people, as I'm sure you know, who believe that it'd be impossible to bring more than 100,000 militant Negroes into Washington without incidents and possibly riot.
I don't think there will be any rioting. I don't think 100,000 people just assembling is cause for apprehension about a riot.
The city of Washington closed all the liquor stores, which really is insulting to the people who came. I mean, I guess the fear was we'd all go out to a liquor store and get drunk and riot in the streets.
Later, he would become chairman of the NAACP, but that day, a 23-year-old Julian Bond served as the communications director for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Army personnel were on call in case something untoward happened. They had a guy up in front of the stage with an axe to cut off the sound if one of the speakers said something inflammatory. A whole series of things that really made you know that official Washington did not think this was something that ought to happen, and if they could, they were going to make sure it wouldn't get out of hand.
A peaceful protest had always been the goal. In the days before the march, volunteers made 80,000 cheese sandwiches to feed the hungry crowd. In the night, few people had arrived. Black leaders feared they had failed.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome.
Those worries soon evaporated along with the morning dew. Attendees came by the busloads, and Washington was alive with thousands of marchers. Many black celebrities and stars from Hollywood came to support the cause.
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
By the time Martin Luther King reached the dais, a crowd of nearly 500,000 blanketed the mall. Despite the stature history now accords him, Dr. King was not the acknowledged leader of the masses spread before him.
I think many of the people who were activists felt that he was too cautious.
Back then, Dr. Claiborne Carson was a college student, anxious to take up the cause of civil rights.
I was curious about the movement. This was the biggest thing going on during my youth.
Carson tells his story about attending the march in his book, Martin's Dream. In time, he would come to be the editor of Dr. King's papers and write his autobiography. Some of his thoughts about King might surprise you.
Rosa Parks, she's the one who made King possible. You know, she took the action that she thought was necessary in Montgomery. At that time, King was simply a minister of a church. She turned him into a civil rights leader.
Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside.
The night before, King had crafted his speech on paper for hours, but when it was over, he spoke from the heart instead.
Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
And now, no one remembers the prepared text. Everyone remembers the extemporaneous remarks.
When And the Dream Lives On continues, a look at the key to racial progress, education.
50 years from now, the only way that's going to change is to not give people a handout, but a hand up, and that's through education.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up the true meaning of its creed. Hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Carver High School opened its doors in 1951. In all, Montgomery County would operate separate but equal schools from 1866 until 1955. Last October, Montgomery County Schools staged a reunion of the segregated schools. Nearly 300 former students and teachers came together to reminisce. There was music and dinner, but mostly there were memories.
This piano had a sign under the clock. It said, "Time will pass. Will you?"
Some of them have not seen each other for 30 years or 40 years.
We can tell each other how old we are and not be embarrassed.
Now in their 70s and 80s, these one-time teachers and students remembered the hardships of their segregated school days.
Montgomery County is a rather large county, and some of the students travel long distances by bus.
We learned, in spite of the fact that our textbooks were often outdated and they were hand-me-downs.
Carver Junior High School closed its doors in 1960, and its former students had to cope with the changes integration brought.
Our teachers cared for us more. They knew our parents, and we got a little bit of family tenderness, I would say, in the segregated schools.
It hurt because we lost our community.
Despite fond memories of their old schools, these pioneers in integration know the changes were for the best.
I think it helped because it helped the races to get to know each other.
But not everyone was welcoming. Being first had its price.
There was still a lot of insensitivity on the part of many of the white teachers.
Yes, it was tense. It was culture shock, and you learned, I personally learned, that you're supposed to tell people when things happen and not react and have faith in the system. The system didn't always work, but yeah.
You're right.
Now senior citizens, they reflect on how things have changed since they were in school.
My boys did not know of anything about segregation, and their friends were of all nationalities.
We got a long ways to go. I feel, personally, it's not what it used to be, but it's not what it can be.
Few Washingtonians know the role Anacastia's John Philip Sousa School played in school desegregation. It's become a forgotten chapter in local history. In the early 1950s, a group of 11 black school children petitioned the D.C. School Board to be admitted to the then brand new all-white junior high school. When they were denied, they filed a lawsuit against the school board and its chairman, C. Melvin Sharp. The leading plaintiff was a young man named Spotswood Thomas Bowling. The case went before the Supreme Court in 1954. That year, Bowling versus Sharp and the better remembered Brown versus the Board of Education were both upheld by the court. In the fall, Spotswood Bowling and his 10 schoolmates started classes at Sousa, ending segregation in the District of Columbia for what promised to be forever.
It's really a sad state of American history that the civil rights movement got its chops by way of desegregation. The sad reality is we're probably as segregated now in terms of our education system than ever before.
For 12 years, Kevin Chavis served on the D.C. City Council, where he headed the Education Committee.
The District of Columbia is the only city in America where you just don't have any poor ethnic whites. All the white folks in D.C. are people of means. They're middle class or above, so it really exacerbates the issue of race and class in schools in D.C. unlike any other place.
So while the counties that surround D.C. rank among the best school districts in America, D.C. schools continue to languish. One solution: independently run charter schools.
The beauty of the charter school movement, which I was a strong advocate for when I was on the council, is that you just don't have the bureaucracy. And I think part of the solution is, not just more charter schools, but more choice offerings for parents.
Today, 40% of D.C. students attend charter schools. Meanwhile, the D.C. Public Schools report card reveals only 20 to 30% of its students get passing grades.
We are the only district in the country on high-risk status with the Department of Education, and only 9% of our entering freshman class graduate from college within 5 years.
But as former school chancellor Michelle Rhee discovered, changing the system will not be easy.
I think Michelle Rhee was terrific in terms of what she talked about. I think that we need a jolt to the system, and I think she offered that. And I think that in her zeal and in the mayor's zeal to try to make sure that they were aggressive about change and they got people to believe they were serious, that they forgot that you got to bring folks along. So I think that, we're really at a crossroads. I think this is the most important issue in America. I think D.C. is a fulcrum for what should be possible, because if we can educate our children in far southeast like we do in far northwest, then we can be a model for the country.
When And the Dream Lives On comes back, racial differences that keep us apart.
America is still fundamentally divided by race and class.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise, live out the true meaning of its creed. Hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
In the 50-plus years since segregation ended, the diversity of our Washington area neighborhoods hasn't changed all that much. Back then, it was called white flight, families moving to the suburbs to avoid desegregated schooling. And its effects linger on, with outlying affluent counties in Virginia and Maryland still predominantly white. And the farther away you move from the city's center, the more white it becomes. In the late 60s and early 70s, blacks with means moved to Prince George's County. In sharp contrast, within the district, more than half its residents are black and 25% live in poverty.
There's been tremendous displacement of the African American community.
One of those communities was Queen City, home to about 150 families near today's Pentagon. Queen City had its own churches and a few small shops. But in 1941, when plans for the Pentagon got underway, the families were moved into trailers in a matter of days, and some of them would live there for years.
The inhabitants received a small stipend, and it still hurts. It wasn't any torn down, ragged place. It was a place of self-reliance and dignity. That narrative has been jettisoned in favor of, gentrification is the best thing going. In one of the great large instances of urban renewal in Southwest Washington in the mid-1950s, 22,500 residents were forced out of Old Southwest. 110 residential blocks were basically plowed up and flattened in an idea for, again, urban renewal.
DC's Shaw neighborhood shows the sharp contrast between urban renewal and urban revitalization. After the riots of 1968, the community formed a grassroots organization to restore their homes and businesses. Today, Shaw thrives as one of DC's most vibrant areas, rich in Black culture.
People aren't naturally against progress. What they are against is a heedless, thoughtless plan that doesn't take their wishes and needs into account. What remains should be marked and saved, and too much of this city's African American history is disappearing brick by brick and yard by yard every day.
One look at the DC skyline these days tells you there is a wealth of construction here, but so far many DC residents aren't cashing in on it.
District residents are employed at less than half the rate of suburban residents, and that compared to these other cities along the Northeast Corridor, the district ranks dead last.
Despite nearly $800 million construction dollars being spent in DC and first source laws that would guarantee local employment, a lack of hiring led to this protest last year.
Open that gate.
It was outside the construction site that will convert St. Elizabeth's Hospital into the Department of Homeland Security.
The most recent estimates are somewhere between 14 and 20% of local hiring, which is much lower than what we would hope for.
We literally have people who can go on their back porch and look at the site, but can't work on that site.
Reverend George Gilbert heads up the group called DC Jobs or Else. In his part of the city, Wards 7 and 8, the unemployment rate is more than 22%. Last year, he brought vans filled with job seekers to this trailer downtown twice a week. In all, over 115 men and women filled out applications here.
At that time, not one was called, interviewed, or hired. But they also made us take our applications and apply for the jobs out in the rain.
DC is a long way from filling a potential 11,000 construction jobs with its residents. So you have to wonder why the mayor's office presents plaques and letters to companies who have hired less than 370 local workers, a number far below what is required by law.
Construction jobs tend to be very good jobs. They pay a living wage frequently, and they are a pathway out of poverty for many, and they have been for decades.
Tom Kafkas works for Good Jobs First, a nonprofit that looks at best practices in employment nationwide. In his comprehensive report, Taxation Without Employment, he names the 3 reasons why companies say they can't hire the required number of district workers.
Some of their excuses are that, the district's educational system is failing and that there isn't enough money being spent training residents for these construction jobs. And they even point the finger at drug abuse. There's no evidence that drugs are any worse here than they are in New York City. In terms of the educational system, we know from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that many construction jobs don't require even a high school degree.
That if you get hired, you have to be the Jackie Robinson of construction. All of us aren't on drugs. All of us are not just baby makers, but we are citizens who have a lot to offer to the community and to our society.
DC Jobs or Else helped strengthen laws requiring more local hiring and has filed a grievance against one construction company with the Office of Human Rights. After more than a year, they still have no answers.
We know that the people here want to work, they are willing to work, but they're not getting the opportunity.
When we return, interpreting the dream.
There will never be another Dr. King. I mean, he was really a man unique. There's nobody like him then, and there will be, I don't think, anybody like him in the future. And we ought not wait for him to come along.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up the true meaning of its creed. Hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
After Dr. King's speech was over, Claiborne Carson hitched a ride home to Arizona. He never met Dr. King, but after years of poring over his papers, perhaps no one alive knows Dr. King better.
My country tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing.
What King is doing is trying to say, I have something to say about that continuing disjunction between our ideals and American realities. I think that's what the memorial is about. That's what the King legacy is about. If King were around, he would tell us, no, my dream has not been realized yet. I think I would put it in as a part of that continuing dialogue about what does American democracy mean. Jefferson Memorial is part of that dialogue. This country was founded on the basis of certain ideals that haven't been achieved. Lincoln, whose monument is just right over on the right, he continued that dialogue with his great speeches, and I'm sure in the 21st century, maybe right at this memorial, there's going to be someone else coming and making another great statement on what is the idea of America, the American dream, what does it mean in the 21st century? And I hope I'm still here to see that.
Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Today, the King legacy lives on in the words of his remarkable speeches and now in this stunning memorial. But until his vision for America comes true, it's up to us to see that his dream never dies. I'm Robin Hamilton. Thanks for watching.